everyone. Welcome to a rare Saturday night posting of Stand Up with Pete Dominic. But I had to reach out to our friend Bill Boyle, Bill B in D.C., to get his take on what we just saw unfold in Russia. So here I am. The headlines: Putin's most serious threat to power. Monster turns against master. Moscow warns West against leveraging insurrection. Uncertainty in Beijing. Wagner coup fails. Prigozhin exiled. And this headline from the New York Times, and I read this after I talked to Bill, shows how smart he is, because he even said at the end of our conversation, I've got no actual insight on this, but I think the White House probably knew what was potentially in the works. New York Times: U.S. suspected Prigozhin was preparing to take military action against Russia. The information was considered both solid and alarming because of the possibility that a major nuclear-armed rival of the United States could descend into chaos. Senior American national security officials had indications as early as Wednesday that Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, was prepared to take military action against senior Russian defense officials, according to officials briefed on the intelligence. Wow. That's a big story. That's a big headline. And for my part, folks, of course, I've been talking to Bill and several other experts like David Rothkopf and so many others about this conflict since it began. Bill Browder comes to mind. And I paid close attention to it pretty much all day because I was in the car all day. So I was listening to these Twitter Spaces conversations, which were really interesting and enlightening. Got home, read a few of the articles that were put out very quick. And I think I have a pretty good understanding going into this conversation, even though I heard the name Prigozhin so many times and still couldn't remember how to pronounce it and had to ask Bill here at the beginning. So I reached out to Bill Boyle. You can find him on Twitter at Bill B in DC. We have no idea why he's so smart at these things. He's simply an innocent business owner parking garages in Washington, D.C. But he reads all day. He's very well connected. A lot of people like him, and I guess have loose lips. So he has earned credibility here with my audience, and we're always happy to talk to him because he's not trying to make any money, be a pundit. He just says what he thinks based on the information that he's gotten. And so often he has been credible on these issues, predicted things happening, getting them right, talking to the right people, reading the right sources, curating the right sources, and just having a weird brain that allows him to understand, remember, and analyze these things for us. So that's it. Let's do it right now with Bill B. Can you talk real quick? All right. It is Saturday night at 8 o'clock, and I have Bill Boyle. No fewer than 10 people reached out to me today. I got texts, I got emails, I got DMs, I got Facebook messages to talk to you. You got to get Bill on real quick. You were tweeting. I'm glad that you were able to join me. People can read your tweets at Bill B N D C. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to read a piece from The Atlantic, this Professor Phillips Payson O'Brien. This piece is titled Prigozhin Planned This. How do you say his name?
Prigozhin.
Prigozhin. Okay.
Prigozhin.
He writes, what can we tell so far? Prigozhin's preparations for this operation, at least as a contingency plan, must have been in the works for months. Military supplies, including armored vehicles, air defense systems, had to be stockpiled and moved into place inside Russia itself. All of Prigozhin's very public complaining about being deprived of supplies by the Russian military now appear to have been involved in an element of crocodile tears. Prigozhin and his supporters were not able to send a significant military force into action last night, but they also had a logistical network to back it that was capable of moving hundreds of miles a day. The Russian army, now trying to resist Ukraine's counteroffensive, probing, must be looking on in envy. He then says the timing of the plot seems shrewdly chosen. And obviously he then goes on to talk about the two cities that Prigozhin took over. What do you think of what he's saying here? Pick up there.
I think it's really good, and I'll start from the end and go back to the beginning. The two cities he took over. Rostov-on-Don is the city that is the head of the Southern Command. It's where the Southern Command is for the Russian army for Ukraine and for what they call their Southern Command region. All the supplies, logistics, orders, everything else, the strategic planning was happening in Rostov-on-Don, but more importantly, the supplies. With Wagner in that city, he had his thumb on the carotid artery of the Russian army in Ukraine, which gave him a veto on what supplies were going to go through, who was going to take what orders from who. You could switch those. Ministry of Defense for Russia could switch things to Moscow, but technologically it's a pain in the ass. It's hard, and of course it's It's friction, and friction is your enemy in war. That's
and this guy writes just what you just said too. These cities, talking about locations they took over, with their large railway systems, have been used as stockpile military equipment. By seizing control of them, Prigozhin planted his boot on the windpipe of the Russian army.
I did not read the article, but I'm very proud that he had the same. That's awesome. I feel good about that. The other thing about it, and no one's really talking about this, and it's weird. Prigozhin spent 2 to 3 months under really intense scrutiny by the FSB. He was saying all kinds of things, right? Openly saying that this war is fucked up and the leadership is fucked up and whatever. GRU is watching him. The FSB is watching him. To do what they did, at least hundreds of people had to have known what they were planning. Hundreds. Now, I don't know if you've ever run a conspiracy. I've run 1 or 2. There you go. You've had 2. There's no way you keep things secret unless you've literally captured the apparatus. So when people look at this as like, oh, this guy Prigozhin, Mark Hertling called him a warlord today. Warlord mentality. That's not fucking warlord mentality. That is state capture happening. Prigozhin and what he did managed to get large parts of the FSB in Ukraine, probably in Rostov-on-Don, probably in Varnish, probably in Moscow. And the GRU, which is the military intelligence, and the military structure. I mean, these guys knew how many shells they were giving him. They had to know, they would know what his usage of the shells were, because they have radars that tell you where your own artillery is going. So they had to know he was stockpiling. They had to know that he was planning something, and they didn't fucking tell Moscow. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you the rot is enormously deep, number one. Number two, it tells you this is about way more than Prigozhin. Prigozhin is the face of this. But there is clearly a faction in the FSB and the Ministry of Defense, and probably in Moscow amongst the oligarchs and the sort of power players. I don't mean the money guys, but the guys on the National Security Council of Russia, etc. They wanted to put Putin in a position where they could force him to do things, right? They could get to the table and negotiate power, negotiate decisions. That's what this is about. And the idea that this is just some wild ass guy who did this thing, that flies in the face of all the facts. Just what you said, the planning, the logistics, the fact that they kept it secret is such a big deal. And that should be the first thing people should be talking about. That means that hundreds of people went out of their way to cover it up, to protect the operation. It also tells you that, that's not enough. It can't just be that you have people who are willing to do it. They've got to be dedicated. This means that the whole core of what Putin is doing, the logic of it, the trust in it, the belief in it is gone. It is now Putin's war, and they see it as his fault, and they are trying to negotiate power away from him, and they successfully have done so, I would say.
Why? But the big question remains to some extent, or maybe it's been answered. Why? Why would Prigozhin do this, take this risk? And partly he answered it a couple nights ago when he made these videos criticizing the impetus for the beginning of the war, saying it was nonsense, that it was about Nazis or it was about NATO expansion. Yeah. So he's critical of the root reasons that Putin and other Russian leaders gave for the war. But then he's also seemingly critical of these two generals, the leader, the Ministry of Defense guys. Yeah. So it would seem that Prigozhin is upset about either the war itself, that it was ever fought, or the way that it is being conducted. And he wants to get rid of these two guys to do what? To take over the war, to end the war? What was the ultimate aim? To get rid of Putin? Obviously, he didn't do that.
Well, so there's two layers. There's layers to this as well. You notice that he brought up that he really went after the actual fundamental reasons for the war being fought right before he made his move. Now, a lot of people in these sort of conspiracies are going to have different motivations. Prigozhin knew that Shoigu wanted his budget and wanted his men. And Shoigu probably would have imposed upon Putin or gotten out of Putin, or Putin would have wanted to get rid of, as in liquidate, as in kill Prigozhin. Because they would not want, they obviously saw him as a threat. So Prigozhin sees that he's going to be liquidated potentially. Probably knew this 6 months ago. Probably those FSB guys who were helping him keep this secret were going to him and saying, hey, buddy, you're on the list. So the other parts of the faction that started this and made it happen would have been going to Prigozhin and saying, here's our tool. Because if this guy knows he's going to get killed, he'll be the one to make the first move. Because, of course, you and I have discussed this. The hard problem with as nasty a dictatorship as Putin's is that you need to find someone willing to make the first move, right? The first mover problem's hard because if you lose and you lose in the wrong way, your family's being tortured to death in front of you before they kill you, right? That's quite literally what you're looking at. So they would look for a tool that would be suit to purpose, which is Prigozhin's in charge of 25,000 men who may be the best fucking men in the Russian army, who are super professional and are elite, who see themselves as separate from, more well paid, better than the Ministry of Defense, right? So you've got this group of elites who are really highly capable, and they see that their island of professionalism and privilege is going to get subsumed into the MOD, Ministry of Defense. So if you're the whoever's of the various players that helped this set up, you look at them and go, man, these guys are perfect. That's Prigozhin's main original or front up reason is he knows he's going to get fucked. Now, so that's Prigozhin's place. But if you look then at the other people who might have been in this faction who backed Prigozhin in doing this, they have other motivations, one of which is, do you really want to be the guys that are in charge of Russia when the war in Ukraine collapses, goes sideways, and is lost? You don't. And so the best possible outcome for you is to cut Putin's balls off, or at least negotiate power where you have the ability to force him to do things that you want, or to force him to not do things you don't want him to do. And to safeguard your own power, where he is no longer the sole locus of who lives, who dies, who gets paid, who doesn't. But you also don't want that poison chalice. You don't want to be in the office when the war in Ukraine ends. Because when someone in Russia has to say, we're done, we're leaving, we're giving up Crimea, we're giving up everything, that person is going to be hated most intensely by every right-winger in Russia. And that's a Kerensky moment where you try to prosecute the war again and again. You keep going and going and going in 1917 until the Bolsheviks come and kill you, right? And so that is what they want to avoid. So the best position to be in, I think, if you're really clever, is you denude Putin of his power, but you leave him there to let him take the fall when things fall apart. And just think about the position that Putin's in right now, right? They now know, everybody in Russia knows, anyone with 10,000 dedicated troops who can get to Moscow, if they are real combat troops, they're not going to be stoppable. They're not. Because
only if they hold those two military bases in that, right? Like only if they can put their foot on the windpipe and hold down any reactionary force to that.
Well, right, except that now, since the seal has been broken, if the war starts going even worse, and Putin starts acting crazy, the paratrooper division that's 10 miles outside of Moscow, that, by the way, got withdrawn from the Ukraine to be brought back to defend Moscow from things like Prigozhin, which is what's happening now. They're trying to find reliable reserve units in Ukraine and withdraw them to Moscow so that they don't have to worry about a Prigozhin happening again. But then these units themselves now represent another threat to Putin. And they could ride down the road and take him out. And it's not even a question of having Rostov at that point. If you take Putin out in a military coup, and you're the regular army that's doing it, you don't have the Wagner problem anymore. And Rostov will say, sure, we're on your side. So this creates like this situation where the seal has been broken.
Everybody else has seen what Prigozhin accomplished and saying we could do something similar.
That's right.
He's weak. He's not as strong as he appears to have always been, or he's weakened is the point. And the plain fact that Putin was willing to settle after calling Prigozhin a criminal, like earlier that day, what does that say?
Well, so what's really fascinating about that is that Lukashenko, from the leader of Belarus, was brought in as the supposed arbiter. Yeah. And he turned out to be a cannier motherfucker.
Brought in by Putin, is my understanding.
Well, that's the way that Peskov and the Russian Ministry, communications people are putting it. We don't know, to be honest with you. Whatever Peskov says, I would say that's probably not true.
Could be, though.
But Putin's logic would be that he's not going to negotiate directly with Prigozhin. That raises Prigozhin's profile. So I'll bring in my younger brother dictator from Belarus and have him do it. Now, again, I would love to know who suggested Lukashenko, because this is sort of like Godfather 1. Whoever suggests that you negotiate with the other families is probably the one who's betraying you. And at some point, this is going to come out, the ins and outs of this. Whoever got Lukashenko in there, that's the faction. Those are the guys. Because they arranged for Lukashenko now. He now, by the way, owes whoever brought him in. Because Lukashenko now is going to get 5,000 Wagner guys who can't ever go back to Russia. So they're not going to have any allegiance with Russia, right? Because they are now effectively, they were part of an insurgency. He gets 5,000 guys in Belarus who are purely loyal now to Lukashenko because he got them out of being executed for treason in Russia. So he gets a palace guard in Belarus, right? And he then is also owed a favor from Putin and from whatever faction brought him in to negotiate this stuff. And this, by the way, the Godfather reference is intentional because that is what this is about. This is sort of a klept groups that are trying to negotiate power amongst themselves.
I'm confused as to what the negotiation turned out to be in terms of would there be protection or immunity given to all of these fighters in the Wagner followed Prigozhin, because that's my understanding is that they're all get granted immunity. And they're, by the way, fighting in places like, I think, Syria and Africa. These Wagner troops, are they all going to be cut off in those places? Are they all going to be able to continue to fight? What happens to the Wagner fighters?
Right. So there's some nuance to this in the deal that we have read publicly. And trust me, what we've read publicly is the tip of the iceberg sinking the Titanic. Yeah. The rest of it is below the surface. But what we know publicly about Wagner is that the Wagner soldiers that were directly involved in this with Prigozhin, they are given immunity, but they're being sent to Belarus. That's 5,000 men, more or less. Any Wagner guy who is not involved in this, who is in Ukraine, has to sign up as a regular Russian soldier. They're going to have to sign up, be under Shoigu and Gerasimov or whoever follows them. The guys in Africa, I think they create another company and they're just the PMC that's over in Africa, and that's it. I would imagine 5,000 go to Belarus. The other 20,000 that's in Ukraine. Do these guys really, really, really want to be in the regular Russian army under the guys who they literally are? They're on Telegram right now, by the way, talking about how Putin needs to die, how Prigozhin betrayed them, how they'll never fight for Putin or Gerasimov or Shoigu. Like, they're going to lose those 20,000 men. Those guys are going to go join the French Foreign Legion, or they're going to go to Belarus, or they're going to. So the damage on that front has been done, in that the real hardcore of the Russian army, that their assault troops, they're going to be gone.
Let me read Tom Nichols at The Atlantic. Do you like Tom Nichols?
I do. He's quite an expert on Russia.
He writes,
sometimes he annoys me, but on other things, but he's quite good on Russia.
He writes, we can at this point only speculate about why Prigozhin undertook putsch and why it all failed so quickly. One possibility is that Prigozhin had allies in Moscow who promised to support him. I think you were, suggesting that. And somehow that support fell through. Perhaps his friends in the Kremlin got cold feet, or were less numerous than Prigozhin realized, or never existed at all. Prigozhin, after all, is not exactly a military genius or diplomat. He's a violent, arrogant, emotional man who may well have embarked on the scheme, huffing from a vat of his own overconfidence. Nonetheless, this bizarre episode is not a win for Putin. The Russian dictator has been visibly wounded, and he will now bear the permanent scar of political vulnerability. Instead of looking like a decisive autocrat or even just a mob boss in command of his crew, Putin left Moscow after issuing a short video in which he was visibly angry and off his usual self-assured game. Putin reportedly worries a great deal about being assassinated, and so perhaps he wanted to hunker down until he had more clarity about who might be in league with Prigozhin. But whatever the reason, he vowed to deal with Prigozhin decisively and then blew town, probably to retreat to Valdai, and a move that looked weak and disorganized. So first of all, is it confirmed that Vladimir Putin did in fact flee?
There were a couple planes that went to Valdai that looks quite very much like he did flee. And what do you say about the rest of it? And of course, the one plane got. Sorry. Well, he makes the mistake I think most people do about Prigozhin, where he's right about how he describes Prigozhin. At the same time, this emotional, crazy, whatever guy launched a coup that almost succeeded, and somehow did that for 2 months. Did it almost
succeed?
They were an hour from the Duma, and I think that if Wagner had shown up in front of that building, this would not be remotely close to over in terms of violence right now. If they had pulled up in front of the Duma, I don't think there was any Russian troops that were going to fight them. And then there would have been sort of this time of troubles, this crazy period where everyone was trying to figure out who was in charge. But to think that they went from Voronezh to Rostov, and a day later we're literally looking at the skyline of Moscow from just outside of the city, unopposed or almost unopposed. Yeah, they almost succeeded, sure. Now, the aftermath would have been a mess. There's no guarantee he would have held on. And in fact, likely he wouldn't. But a initial coup, very, very much. I mean, I think he kind of, my argument would be he probably did succeed for the interest of the people who supported him.
Two more big questions, I think, that I see in your conclusion. But David Rothkopf, writing in Daily Beast an article about what happened, he writes, the fact that Prigozhin quickly and relatively easily took over the cities of Rostov-on-Don and Voronezh, I'm saying that right, demonstrated. Voronezh. Demonstrated.
Yeah, I'm messing it up too. Yeah.
That the Russian military had finally found an adversary they could defeat. The Russian military. On Twitter, one wag wrote that Russia's military had gone from being the second best army in the world to the second best army in Ukraine to being the second best army in Russia. That's a clever point, but more importantly to me, my question is, the big question for Ukrainians is, what does this mean? You and I have been talking about strategy and what's happening in the war. What does this mean for the war in Ukraine?
So a couple of things. One, I just mentioned that they are removing some reserves from Ukraine to back up Moscow, right? So that's going to, right off the bat, probably the most elite units they can trust are leaving Ukraine. So that takes them off the battlefield. That's number one. Number two, the amount of distrust there's going to be in the Russian military, that the Wagner units alongside a regular paratrooper unit, there's going to be intense distrust. There's going to be, you're going to have Wagner units where, for instance, 13 Russian Air Force pilots got killed by Wagner in the last day. Do you
I heard
really
it was like 7 helicopters and 1 plane, I heard.
Yeah, so 13 crew members in total got killed. Do you really think that the VVS, the Russian Air Force, is going to go, oh, Wagner, you really need an airstrike tomorrow to defend yourselves from the Ukrainians? Yeah, we'll get right fucking on that, boys. Service rivalries are intense in every major military.
Either that or, we missed our intended target and hit you guys.
Oops. Oh, you had that fake rocket attack. Well, maybe this time we'll fucking write for you. I mean, there's going to be some really intense distrust. There's going to be fragging. There's going to be the Wagner guys are going to be walking around like they own the fucking world. They're going to want, it's just an army that is now it was already starting to come apart in morale terms. I think this is going to be quite dangerous to them.
I mean,
I really do.
It would be hard to think that the Ukraine offensive, which has been kind of in a stalemate, apparently, according to most.
I wouldn't call it that at all. Actually,
you would not. That's a lot of analysis I've seen is that they're killing 3 times more Russians, but they got to kill a lot more to gain more strategic advantage.
So the idea, it's corrosive, right? You force the Russians to commit their artillery. The Ukrainians are knocking out. They're doing counter battery fire. And they're forcing the Russians to show where their artillery is, and they're immediately knocking it out. And they're knocking it out, and they're knocking it out. And the idea, rather than do the human wave bullshit the Russians did at Bakhmut, Wagner, by the way, is that you force the enemy else, and then you wear down their ability to respond. It's why it's clear where the Ukrainians are going. It's somewhere in the central front. And so you push them in 4 different places. You make them keep committing. And then at some point, maybe a month from now, the Russians they don't have the force or the ability to keep committing to one point, and then you're suddenly through their defensive lines. And then the war goes in motion. Kherson front, exactly how they did that. It was a dense environment, a lot of fortifications, everything else. They just pushed until the Russians couldn't keep it up. It's called shaping the battlefield. And there's another term called recon pull, that's what it is. You're pushing and pulling the other guy, get him off balance, get him to commit too much of his weight in one direction, and then you pull him over and you knock him down. And so I think what they're doing is, let me put it this way, the idea that they're getting 3-to-1 casualties in their favor while on offense into heavy fortifications and some of the heaviest minefields in the world.
Right.
That's fucking miraculous. That's amazing. That's amazing. That is, you know, the U.S. military in that environment expects to lose 25% of every unit they put in. So you look at what's going on with the Ukrainians right now, they might be the best army that's been in the world since World War II.
Well, you know, something about the incentive often makes an army fight better. And when you're defending your homeland, you're being invaded. I mean, it's so much different than the military conflicts that Americans are familiar with in our lifetime. But speaking of which, that's the last thing I want to ask you. Like, to me, undercovered purposely because the primary issue here is the actual trying to understand and analyze a coup attempt and what it all means for the conflict there. But I do think that it's pretty interesting, people pointing out today that this could have never happened and would have never happened, if Putin never invaded. He would have been maintained a very strong role in the world. But he did, and the Ukrainians fought with the leadership that they have, and they're winning and they've won, surprising apparently everybody. But the thing to me that I want to kind of comment or get you to comment on is pretty easy to see in hindsight. If Joe Biden had not won the election, then the Ukrainians wouldn't have had the support that they have had from the rest of the world, because we lead on that. Obviously, we basically, you know, lead on NATO for sure and everything else. And so you would have never, I guess we would have probably never even gotten here, because they would have taken over Kyiv long ago if Trump had won. And I just think it's worth mentioning, you know, and Ben, finally, if you want to address this, you're hearing right wingers and probably some on the left said the CIA was involved in this, or it was, you know, it's not like the CIA is involved in all kinds of coup attempts, successful, mostly failures throughout American history. So it wouldn't be, but we haven't seen the involvement of American intelligence community in this conflict very much, it would seem.
Well, the American intelligence community is heavily involved in ISR, in surveillance, satellite
and surveillance and logistics. Satellites.
Military-oriented intelligence.
Yeah.
I am quite sure the CIA is spying the crap out of all these guys, of course. But the idea that this coup is driven by American impulses or money or anything else is complete bullshit. There's no evidence of that. But, you know, there's a thing like doctors say, like when you're trying to diagnose something, you don't look for zebras, you look for horses, right? The obvious thing is that this is just an internally driven, domestically driven problem of the Russians, and that's it. It's completely ridiculous. But I personally think that we should all buy a beer for every single one of those 70,000 or so people that made up the margin between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in 2020.
And
because that margin saved the fucking world. And I'm not kidding. Because if Russia wins in Ukraine, we are probably looking at China going after Taiwan. We're looking probably at the end of NATO. We're probably looking at European countries and Asian countries going nuclear. I mean, you're really at a hinge.
Right. And instead, that may or may not have happened, but it would have been a very possible scenario. Instead, we see a completely different scenario where Putin is weakened, very weakened, and China is looking at him going, what are you doing? You're destroying everything that we had built.
Well, imagine China's reaction to watching this almost coup.
Yeah.
Right? They're going, Xi has to be saying to himself, man, you start a war, you don't know where it ends up. And that is a very salutary lesson to any dictator out there who wants to start a war. You look and you think, I don't know which way this is going to go. Churchill's famous line was something along the lines of, it's easy to predict the beginning of a war. Nobody can predict its end. And that's what we're seeing here.
The bottom line, it would seem, and you know, feel free to add anything here, but at the end of his piece, Rothkopf writes, in the hours and days ahead, the world will be watching to see whether the deal was reportedly struck holds and what it entails. What will become of Russia leadership? Will it change? How will it react to this harsh repudiation of its strategies and tactics in Ukraine? What will become of Prigozhin and Wagner? Close attention will be paid to whether other voices critical of Putin may emerge. Naturally, a special focus will be on whether these events lead to more heavy-handed tactics on the part of Putin. Constant watch will be directed to whether Russia's nuclear arsenal remains secure. And in Ukraine, expect military leaders to swiftly seek to test resolve how these unexpected events have weakened Russian positions and then move to take advantage of the opportunity delivered to them by Russia's dysfunction. The unexpected has happened. Now, as is so often the case in history, the edge will go to those who are best prepared to take advantage of it. And finally, he mentions just basically both Prigozhin and Putin need to sleep maybe with both eyes open.
I think Prigozhin will be dead in a year. I think he got used by whoever encouraged him or helped him. And I think that he will die in his sleep or fall out of a window or whatever. His relationship with gravity is about to become quite complicated.
Okay.
I think that Putin has a choice in front of him because he looks at how people reacted in Rostov and in Voronezh they were ecstatic with the Wagner guys who were saying this war's fucked up. It's being run in a bad way, and Putin sucks. And people on the streets were applauding them, high-fiving them, bringing them drinks and food. So Putin has lost at least some of the people, probably most of them, when it comes to this war. And he's seen evidence of it. Can't deny, this is no longer a position where Putin's isolated. He has gotten dragged to his plane and flown out of Moscow because they couldn't be sure of his security. So the cobwebs have been, to a large degree, probably blown away for the moment. He has two choices. Does he go for repression? Does he go for conciliation? Does he have the running room anymore to do either one? We don't know. Because a lot of what happened in this, a lot of the negotiation, a lot of the players are still below the surface and are likely to remain there. But if you're Putin, by the way, again, going back to what I was saying before about how Prigozhin was able to pull this off, Putin now cannot trust the FSB. He cannot trust the Ministry of Defense. The Interior Ministry troops wouldn't fight Wagner even though they were told to. So he can't trust them. So you have the instruments of control and power and violence. He no longer can trust any of them. Is Putin the kind of guy to go on a charm offensive and make everybody love him? Like, I don't know when the last Russian was able to do that, but he doesn't. It's not a mobilized dictatorship, right? Like I'd love to say all the time, it's a demobilized dictatorship. Well, does he really want to gin up a lot of emotions when it's clear the emotions are on the side of the people who fucking hate him? So he's now in this really weird place where I'm not sure he knows what to do. If I were advising him, I would tell him to jump on a plane to Saudi Arabia and don't come back, because I don't think it ends well for Putin. Remember that Gorbachev had a 91 coup attempt. Yeah. This is our third coup attempt, Pete, by the way, in our lifetime in Russia. He had a 91 attempt in Russia, 93 knocked him out. So if you are Putin and you're looking at your history, you're looking at Tsar Nichols. He had his 1905 revolution where he had to make a bunch of concessions. And then in 1917, he was out. This is the pattern in Russia. You've got this powerful guy and no one can fuck with him. There's an attempt. It doesn't work, but the seal is broken. The mandate of heaven is lifted. And now Russians start to say, okay, what's going to be fucking next? And by the way, in the middle of a war, it was that way in 1905 against Japan. He got booted out in 1917, Tsar Nicholas. With Gorbachev, it was the war in Afghanistan that led to all this. And this is a far worse war than Afghanistan was, with much bigger effects, much more dangerous to Russia, much more painful. So I think if you're Putin, you have to be figuring that if historical trends apply, then the next guy that comes for you is going to kill you.
Hey, I appreciate everything. Just last question. How did you watch this unfold? How plugged in were you when it was happening? Because it was interesting. We're in an interesting time media-wise, and we see that the old corporate legacy media doesn't have the resources. They don't resource the way they used to cover these foreign conflicts. They don't have as many people on the ground, obviously, in even the war in Ukraine, number one. And we'd rather American audiences care more about the submersible story, perhaps. But it was interesting to see new media and social media. For example, Twitter Spaces was very popular because I liked it because there was about 50 different, quote, experts that all disagreed on the channel I was listening to. And it was a lot of speculation, but they were also getting reports and confirming reports from, the confirmed identity Twitter accounts and other sources. So I thought that was really fascinating. But how do you think you can most responsibly watch and get good information? What did you do in the future on these things?
Well, so my personal experience was that I went out really late on Thursday night and got smashed with friends. And then I woke up Friday morning and there was like a text from somebody I know who was like, fuck, dude, you got to watch this. And so I thought I was going to have a really chill. I had like 2 meetings during Friday, but they were like Zoom. And I was like, this is great. I don't have to take a shower. I can drink a lot of water and I can, just have this chill day. And then my phone started blowing up and blowing up and blowing up. And so I spent my meeting ended at 11 yesterday, my second one. I spent from 11 in the morning until 2 in the morning on Twitter in particular. And just, the issue here is that I can curate because of what I know about.
Yeah. You got a bunch
I can curate who to listen to.
Right.
I will tell you that if you can do that, this is the golden age.
You should make a list and share it with us.
I would be happy. Actually, I will do that. I will do that. Josh from Talking Points Memo, he has a really great list on Russia.
Josh Marshall,
he's good. Josh Marshall. He kept sending it out yesterday, which is great.
Okay.
And his list is quite good.
Okay.
But if you can curate it, or you can get somebody else to curate it, it's the golden age for news. Because I was hearing things that were, 20 years ago, New York Times was amazing, but you would have to wait a full day.
Yeah. Right.
And when you got the news, it was already half a day old.
Right.
So you have to just be careful not to get ahead of things. You have to be careful about not jumping the gun on things. You notice I didn't post a lot yesterday. I posted a lot for a normal day, but I didn't post relative to the events that were happening because I was afraid of getting ahead of what could be confirmed. But I was on Twitter and I was texting. I went to bed at 2. I woke up at 7. And I had dozens and dozens of text messages on my phone. I have to tell you, official Washington last night, except interestingly for, I think, the people most associated with the White House, everybody else seemed completely shocked, utterly blown away, and are still blown away. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations today. It feels to me, and this is just an outside view, I don't have any inside track on this, but I think the White House knew. I think they were seeing the signs for a couple of weeks and were not at all surprised by this.
Interesting.
You noticed everyone else was going, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. And the White House was kind of like, yeah, we're having a meeting.
I didn't notice that, but if you did, okay then.
I have a thing where I look to see who's panicking and look to see who isn't. And that if the White House suddenly was ordering 50 pizzas and suddenly people were rushing into work and you read about it or hear about it, then they didn't know.
But it's not as if but you're not insinuating that they knew what the outcome was. You're insinuating that they knew something was in the works.
That's right. Yeah. Something was up.
Yeah.
They knew something was up. They didn't know how it was going to turn out. They didn't necessarily know.
They still could have ordered pizza to stay up and watch it unfold. I think that was a terrible example of what looks like panic with your pizza.
Honestly, it's not a bad one.
I don't know why you think a bunch of pizzas mean that people are panicking, but
it's 100% what happens. Anytime in DC that there is some sort of like kerfuffle, and people suddenly have to stay at work late.
Here come the pizzas.
All you'd have to do is watch
But why wouldn't they still stay at work, just like the rest of us were staying up watching it? It doesn't matter. The point is made.
The point is that they have to go back to work without dinner. And then they order the pizzas in.
The point is that you're saying official Washington was shocked, and it seems like the Biden administration may have been no. And you don't. And as you said, you don't have any inside information. It's just a feeling. All right. Well, that was awesome. Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
My great pleasure. Thanks again.
All right, bud. All right, there he goes at Bill B in D.C. Everybody, check him out. Go thank him for joining us. And I can't do this show without your support. And this is what I'm able to do is turn interviews with smart people around quicker than almost everybody in corporate media. That's for damn sure. And frankly, most in independent media too. I book it, I host it, I edit it, I post it, I get it up for you to listen to. That's what you're paying for. So sign up now. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And I will talk to you on Monday, maybe before. Who knows?